So the first, I have two Brunellos with me today, and the first one I wanted to mention that we have a really great supply on is Castelli Martinozzi. This is a wine that Greg acquired, and the supervisor of the project is a very dear friend of ours, Paolo Cacciornia. Paolo's a Tuscan who also has he and his brother have property on Mount Etna and make outstanding wines. But this particular wine comes to us. It's the first vintage we've had. It is produced in large Slavonian oak barrels, and it's just delicious. It has really nice ripe fruit, very soft tannins, a subtle kiss of new oak, and it's a wine that's, although it can be consumed now, it's only going to improve with age. And then the second wine I wanted to mention was one that we sent out on an email recently. That it really is one of the great wines of the vintage. It's made by Andrea Costanti. It's the Costanti wine. Many of you who've had Brunello in the past who've tried Costanti know how good these wines are. They combine power and elegance. There's a depth and ageability to the wines, and yet Andrea's touch, it always seems to have a certain amount of elegance and softness. And this wine, again, is really one of the top wines of the vintage. So if you're going to put money into 15, definitely consider buying a bottle of the Costanti. I don't think you'll be disappointed.
And how long do you think it will age?
I think this will be one of the better agers of the vintage. Over the next 10 years, I think it's just going to improve. These wines have, there's something about Sangiovese when it's made in this style and it's fresh and it has so little oak influence that the wines age gracefully. And I think that Sangiovese benefits from some time in the bottle. So again, those of you who want to open something now, 15 is a perfect vintage for that. And yet the wines, especially this wine, will continue to age gracefully.
Can you talk a little bit about what happened in the vintage that made it a unique year?
Well, 2015 was a very, very warm year. And because of that, there's a certain ripeness. And I think what was really impressive about 2015 for me was looking at the expertise and the work in the vineyards. So it's very difficult with Sangiovese. If it gets too ripe, it loses a little bit of that perfume and that depth, that sweet core of dry extract that I like about Sangiovese. But Montalcino, it's really tricky in a warm year as to when do you pick. If you pick too late, you get higher alcohol, you get a little bit less perfume, and it changes 3 or 4 days after what might be the ideal harvesting time. Sometimes some of those wines can lack freshness. So I think overall, there are some incredible wines from 2015. Yes, in every vintage there are wines that are not perfect, but as a whole, it's a really great vintage.
And you think the winemaking is just getting better, and they're picking at a better time and learning their vineyards better? Is that's part
yeah, I think that what my colleague Greg St. Clair has said over and over is that from the time that even when he started going to Montalcino to now, there's one of the main probably improvements that's been made is in the vineyard. The wines are fresher, they're more vibrant. There's a certain focus on better fruit, on better vineyard management and practices that have really elevated the category. And I agree with them. I think the wines have never been better. I think there's over 250 or 260 producers now. There might even be more. Some buy fruit and make the wines. Not everybody owns property there, but yeah, the farming practices are definitely head and shoulders above where they were, years ago.
Yeah, how have you seen that translate in the bottle? How did they start out when you started in this category?
Well, there were fewer producers, and any area like that, Tuscany's transitioned greatly. In Montalcino, there's just been a lot of investment in the learning process. There were people that knew from the very beginning how to make great Brunello, but there's also been an opportunity to look at cooperage, to look at hygiene, and then how are we managing in the vineyard. If you look at the old days, there were certain practices that were generational, and more recently you've had some I guess you'd call them consultants or enologists that have come into the picture that have looked and seen what works best. So in different areas, there's a lot of different clones of grapes, and planting the proper clone to that soil type also makes a difference. And those kinds of, when to prune, when to pick, all of those different things have come into play without getting too technical. And as they started to look at different properties, how do we make the best possible wine? Do we cut our yields? Do we use certain clones? These are the questions that a lot of the producers that I've spoken with have said over the years, that making those improvements, those gradual improvements and investments in the vineyard have made the difference.
Do you think that those investments were inspired by the success of Super Tuscans? I mean, is there a correlation between?
I don't know if I could answer that. I know that, my focus over the years, like Greg has, Greg has an expertise in pretty much Italian wine.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've focused on was Piemonte, Langhe specifically. And one of the producers there said to me, we went to our parents' generation and we said, we want to invest in new barrels. We want to change some of the practices in the vineyards. We want to cut the yields. You can imagine historically, that's expensive, because if you're looking at it as getting the most yield out of your vineyard, and then you decide you're going to cut that yield, you have to raise the price to compensate for what you've lost in volume. So Tuscany was not a very wealthy area in the sense of, in a general sense. There were people, that obviously had money, but when you think about a grower who has to get as much money as they can for that year, they're going to produce the best possible grapes, but they're going to have high yield. And then when you start seeing the change of cutting those yields and making a more concentrated wine and a wine that's a higher quality, and then the price has to go up to compensate for that. So right now we have some of the best wines that have ever been made. I mean, it's amazing how good the wines are across the board. The quality level is incredible. So even since I started going to Italy in the early 80s, it's an amazing advance when you see the sheer number of wine producers and the quality level across the board.
How did you get interested in Italian wine? How did that become?
Well, I started traveling to Italy I was just going to school in London, and I took a spring break and went to Rome, and I happened to be staying with a family who the husband really understood wine and started tutoring me while I was staying there, and ended up spending an extra week on my spring break to enjoy Rome, but also to learn about the wines. And so that's what started my interest in understanding wine in context at the dinner table. And they taught me that when your legs are under the table, that was the time to appreciate Italian wine, to go with food. So I came back, and of course my parents would ask me why there were wines in the refrigerator, because my parents didn't drink. So that, during my college years, I got interested in wine, and I gradually would purchase wines, and then I transitioned into the wine business. I was moonlighting. I had a different career, and then I moonlighted and ended up transitioning full time. So it was a passion from the time I was about 22 years old, and that's where I got started.
And what would you pair at the dinner table with Brunello in general, but with maybe these in particular?
Well, I think ideally, if we had more of it here, would be a wild boar, which they call cinghiale. When Greg and Mike Paris and I were over there on business in 2016, we went to Barici and had a cinghiale fest. I mean, almost every dish had some.
They told me about this.
And they have probably 500,000 wild boar around Tuscany, especially in that area. And so there's a lot of that consumed. So any type of like roasted meats, even grilled meats, are ideal with Brunello, or pastas with meat in it. I think meat really brings out a little bit of fat with this kind of wonderful fruit and acidity. Would be like the first dish I think of when it comes to Brunello. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to go out and find wild boar, but something similar, lamb or a roast or beef steaks, wonderful with Sangiovese.
And for vegetarians, is there an option?
I don't know. I haven't really thought about that.
Maybe mushrooms.
Mushrooms would work great because they have an earthy character. The other thing I recommend with Sangiovese is that it has a cellar temperature, a little bit lower temperature, because there's something about Sangiovese when it warms up, it loses its focus. In my opinion, I think just a little slight chill on it really brings it into focus, and you really see the greatness of excuse me, you see the greatness of the wine.
Like at 60, 65 degrees.
Or even 55, 60, perfect. Or let it warm up on its own if it's too cold. But pulling a wine out of the cellar, opening it up, Sangiovese deserves air. But in the warm months, we go through the summer months, and if you open up a wine during the summer, you want to make sure that it has a little bit of a chill on it, because it can get really warm. The ambient temperature can raise the temperature of the wine.
So if you were to drink these now, would you decant them?
I think that's personal.
Okay.
I personally don't like to decant. Some people do. I think that when you have a young wine with high acidity, or excuse me, with big tannins, sometimes that really helps. It helps flood the wine quickly with oxygen. I like to open the bottle, pour a little bit out, and just let it sit and decant on its own. That's how I like to enjoy the wine, but that's personal. Others like to have that decanter and pour it in and just let it open up more rapidly. You have to clean a decanter, so that's the other thing for me. I don't like cleaning. So
it's hard to clean a decanter.
Yeah.
Is there anything I missed?
I don't think so. I think there's always more questions that can be asked, and there's more curiosity about wine in general. And I don't think there's any way we could cover every bit. I think if Greg were here, he would have 100 other things to say about Montalcino that I couldn't possibly even think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, he has all those personal stories about the producers, right? Because he knows them all.
But the one thing I will say is that K&L is committed to our customers. We really appreciate all of our customers and the business that you give us. And when it comes to Montalcino, I think Greg has an unparalleled selection across the board. There's all different types. We have some of the more classic traditional style, meaning they're aged in large barrel, maybe a little more acidity. In some cases, it depends on where the property is. We have wines that are more the opposite, that are made in small barrel, that have a little bit more of that toasty oak, and some of our customers love that. We have types that are sort of straddle the fence between the two. So all of those, these two are made in a more classic style, but they also offer, the forward fruit that's so wonderful in these warmer years, but they also will give you some longevity. So, two really great examples of Brunello that we wanted to offer to our customers.